Welcome to the August National Urban League Health Equity webinar series on emergency preparedness. We're really excited to have the panel today. I'm Lydia Isaac. Excuse me. I'm the Vice President of Health Equity and Policy, and we do these monthly health equity webinar series to share knowledge and information and get questions answered for our community. And today in particular, in August, we would really wanted to do something on emergency preparedness as we know the seasons that we're coming into with hurricane season, including, flu and other seasons that can cause, pandemics and these other things, earthquakes. I will say it was small. I didn't feel it, but supposedly there was an earthquake here in New York over the weekend. I'm in New York for anybody who don't know. And so as we start seeing more of these issues happening in our communities, I just wanted to get us prepared. So we have a distinguished panel with us today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say each of their names, but I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell you all a little bit about each of their organizations. So first we have Marcus Coleman, who's the Vice President of at United Way in Community Resilience and Strategy. We have Dr. Atyia Martin, who's the Chief Executive Officer of All Aces Inc. And we have one of our own. I love to say this about her because Brandi has done this for us lots of time, but we have Brandi Richard Thompson, who's the founder and chief communication strategist of BRComm. And Brandi was one of our YPs. She was our YP president for a long time. So it's nice to have her coming home and helping us. And Brandi is here in her capacity to share knowledge with the affiliates. So I'm going to let each one of them tell us a little bit about their organizations. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Martin, and then we're going to get into our questions.
Happy Tuesday, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you. I am, as was said, the CEO for a firm called All Aces Inc. But today I'm wearing my Next Leadership Development hat, which is a nonprofit that has been around for over 20 years. And we focus on strengthening resilience in Black communities. And one of our primary national initiatives is the Black Resilience Network. And that is the lens through which I will be sharing my thoughts and being in community and conversation today. And just for additional context, I am a former emergency manager, both in traditional emergency management as well as public health preparedness. And so I bring also that lens to the conversation as well, and excited to be here with you all. Thank you so much for having me.
Marcus.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning to our folks on the West Coast. So my name is Marcus Coleman. As mentioned, I'm at United Way Worldwide. So I am also an urban leaguer. Of course, not as esteemed as my former fearless leader, Brandi Thompson, but from Tucson, Arizona originally. So was a child of the Tucson Urban League. And then when I moved over to the East Coast, was a part of the Northern Virginia Urban League. And had a very brief stint at the Thursday Network as a member of the YP Network. Currently, as mentioned, we focus on community resiliency at United Way Worldwide. My charge is to help United Way Worldwide and its members and affiliates across the globe focus on 4 key areas. So disaster resilience, climate resilience, economic resilience, and personal resilience. We know and recognize at United Way that there's been long-standing partnerships, especially at the affiliate level and local United Way level in a number of areas. And as I was talking with Dr. Isaac, I'm so grateful to have this conversation and for her team pulling this together. This is another area where we are hoping to help expand partnerships between Urban League affiliates and local United Ways here in the U.S. And continue to help our United Ways be thoughtful in all places in the world, including on the continent, how to continue to engage in community resiliency. So pleasure to be here. Context kind of to following Dr. Martin's lead. So my emergency management context, I spent the better half of the past 12 years in and around the federal disaster space, most recently in a capacity at the Federal Emergency Management Agency as the director for the Center for Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships, where I believe I may have met some of you at the convening held in New Orleans last June. So with that, I will pass it over to Ms. Rashard Thompson.
Good morning, Urban Leaguers. I am Brandi Thompson. I am the founder and CEO of BRComm. My emergency management experience, as I have shared with many of you prior to today, has been at FEMA. and I have been there for about 20 years. I'm in the process of retiring right now. So I'm here in my communication strategist hat and perspective. But most recently worked on the Los Angeles wildfires, started my career with Hurricane Katrina. And so bring that level of expertise around emergency management, recovery, communications, and how we galvanize people and help them to recover following disasters. And so my hope is that I can share some of those nuggets with you today. And I'm really just happy to be a part of this conversation. So thank you to Lydia and Lillian and the rest of the National Urban League family for the invitation and the important conversation around disaster preparedness and emergency management, because it's so important in our communities right now.
Thank you all so much. I just got so many nuggets just from like the introduction. So let's get us started. So it is August. We're about to get into, as Brandi just talked about, hurricane season, but not only hurricane season, we know there's wildfires happening in Canada that's having air issues right now. We're seeing flooding in Florida and different places. So what do we need to know about what's happening? Because when we think disasters, and also let's also talk about disasters that are not natural. There's also man-made disasters, right? And so we never can anticipate when those are going to happen because, you know, humans are unpredictable. But I want us to think about what should we be thinking out right now if we're putting our disaster preparedness, emergency management hat on for this season. Let's talk about this season, and we'll widen out. What should we be thinking about, and what should we be worried about? Anybody can take it. Go ahead.
I'll start. So, um, if I was an affiliate and anybody that's operating at regardless of your area of coverage, be it a particular city, a county, or a state, the first question I would ask, I would use the time for us to assign a member of your team to either contact your local emergency management agency, or if you have the relationship with your mayor or some other local or appointed official. And the first question I would ask is, what's your plan? What's your plan for how you're going to address shelter operations? In the event, right, to your point, Dr. Isaac, we're in hurricane season, we're in peak hurricane season. So this is about the time where we start to see those hurricanes that have large impacts. And as many of you know, and many of you may have questions, I think it is really important for every affiliate to have a briefing of some sort from their city emergency management agency, from their county emergency management agency, if they have the relationships from the state, to really get a sense of what the plan is set to help address, again, shelter operations, evacuations, how they are planning to meet the needs of people that are impacted by things that might have wide-reaching implications like hurricanes. And part of it is also, I think, being prepared to talk about where your coalition of nonprofit partners, of corporate partners, of community partners are positioned to help with community outreach, and then get a sense of understanding what's the kind of agreement that we need in place to get access to trusted information on the government side, especially local government, or what's the kind of agreement that we need to have in place that in the event that there is a major incident, that if there is some feedback that your particular affiliate can provide just based on what you're hearing in the ground, that it's fed into a local emergency operations center. I know many of you have a lot of experience with different disasters. And so I know that some of this may not be new, but I think just especially given some of the shifts in how the federal government has postured its position on disaster preparedness and recovery, it's going to be really important to get a sense again from your cities and counties of what the plan is. And it's okay if they pull out their emergency operations plan and it's 600 pages and you can't read it all. That's not what it's about. But I think it is about having some pointed conversation on how to make sure that the insights that you have for the people in the communities that you serve every day, that you can speak in plain language back to them to say, you know, we are working with our city or we are working with our county, and here's what we are going to do together. And here's some ways that we know we can hold local governments accountable to do right by folks in the event that there is a disaster. Or we can be with local governments to be accountable to report the damages to our community, because that's the other big shift. You think about the tornadoes in St. Louis and several other places this year. It is going to be really important that every local government and local emergency management agency has partners that can work with them to help contextualize the damage. Because what's true is many of our communities are going to have a harder time telling that narrative about why they may need different types of assistance, especially in the event of a presidential declaration in certain counties. So that's what I would offer for on the affiliate perspective, is going again to your mayor or to your county emergency manager, local emergency manager, and starting the conversation with what the plan is, and then having some conversations about where your organization or affiliate can help fit, and kind of making sure that that story is told for assistance if it's needed, but that you also have a story to talk about how people can get support if they need it as well.
Just want to add to what Marcus mentioned, and he basically gave you textbook exactly what you should do in order to ensure that you are connected with emergency management in your community. I think for the affiliate network, my impression has been that we have been largely focused on those relationships at the elected level, at the community leader level. But I think we are being asked, and what is being demanded of us now is to look more at our community circles and how we can get down to the grassroots nature of the communities that we serve. Who is the person who is the most trusted voice in the communities, whether they are part of the Urban League or not, the Urban League affiliate or not? How can you bring those people on board and make sure that you can communicate successfully to the people in your community when a tragedy strikes? Because even if you are getting the information from the appropriate emergency managers, you're relaying information back about what it is that you're seeing. That grassroots community communications network is going to be critical to keep people safe and to be able to share the information that you're receiving from leadership down to the people that you serve and the people who regularly access Urban League services through you. So I think those communication channels are going to be really important for organizations like the Urban League moving forward.
Thank you to Marcus and to Brandi for those responses. And I'll build on the concept of the community or grassroots collaborations that are necessary, not just to support response, critical, right, because we need people to survive, and to support recovery, because that is usually where the rubber meets the road post-disaster. And so the more that each affiliate can learn about the emergency operations plan, but also what happens during the recovery process and what role can you play in supporting the successful recovery post-disaster, which takes years. So who are the players if you're in an area where you haven't received a lot of disasters, like in some places in the Northeast, and shout out to the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, if y'all are on. That's where I'm located in Boston. This is where I grew up. And so connections, I have direct connections to them. And also to the Mississippi Urban League, who's been an amazing partner to the Black Resilience Network. And but to continue the thought, it's really important that folks understand the structures that need to be set up post-disaster, because there are a lot of organizations that are national who do understand that disaster recovery structures, and sometimes come in to our communities and take the lead on disaster recovery processes through what's called long-term recovery committees. And we want to make sure that we are in a position to play a leadership role in any post-disaster work, but especially in the recovery process, because that determines where resources and money goes in order to help communities rebuild, to make sure folks are having their unmet needs addressed, as well as to the opportunity for resilience. So what are the day-to-day challenges and issues in our communities that we, particularly the Urban League, has been leaders on helping to address? How do we make sure that in the recovery process, they're actually being addressed? How are we addressing public health issues that are impacting our communities? How are we leveraging it as an opportunity to bolster economic development in our communities? Who's being hired in the recovery process? Which companies are being contracted with in the recovery process? And so just including the recovery piece in there, because we oftentimes don't plan for resilience or recovery.
Can I ask this question? Because Dr. Martin, you really got me thinking about it, and Marcus in your introduction. So one, I want you to talk a little bit about the Black Resiliency Network, and then I want us to talk as a whole about resiliency. What does that mean?
Mhm.
How do we work toward it, and what do we need to think about in order to aim for the goal of resiliency? So, Dr. Martin, start with the Black Resiliency Network.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the alley-oop and that opportunity. I appreciate you. So the mission of the Black Resilience Network really is to make sure that leadership in Black communities are able to play a significant role in the disaster and climate resilience kind of ecosystem. And what that basically means is oftentimes community-based or grassroots organizations are thrust into this response and recovery world, and they don't have the experiences or access to resources and expertise to help them navigate it, to make sure that the community members who are coming to them get what they need from the response and recovery effort. So there's the kind of Black Emergency Operations Center that Marcus Coleman mentioned earlier, which deals with the immediate response and recovery efforts. But then there's also a long-term initiative that we're getting off the ground that we're referring to as Black Resilience Network Community Hubs, which are in essence community-based organizations who are, we're working with them on increasing their capacity and their capabilities to lead post-disasters while they're also supporting the community in their day-to-day efforts. We've worked in across the country. We have just over 100 members in about 24 states. We've worked across the country from post-Helene in North Carolina. We're still working with the community in Asheville, to Mississippi, which we've been working consistently for the last 2 years, over 2 years now, in supporting response and recovery efforts, not just to the tornadoes that happened in 2023, but also the ongoing onslaught of disasters that Mississippi has had to face, and on the back end supporting organizing of community-based organizations on making sure that folks get access to resources, showing up in some of the traditional emergency management spaces like the state VOADs, or voluntary organizations active in disasters, and making sure that the questions that need to be asked are asked, and that we strategize before the meetings, so have the meetings before the meetings, to make sure that we can bring up the issues that folks might be, or that it might be dangerous for folks to bring up for their organizations or their communities. So we strategize on those things, and oftentimes we're creating openings for folks to make sure that those issues get addressed as a part of the process. And the last thing I'll say is the work that's happening in under the leadership of the Mississippi Urban League is really incredible, including work around emergency preparedness. And so you do have folks in your affiliate network who have been playing leadership roles in the response, recovery, and on the preparedness side. And the Black Resilience Network is really excited that we've been able to partner with some affiliates at the local level, and looking forward to opportunities nationally.
So I'm going to say, I think that just answered the question in the chat, which was, there's a question and answer, which was, what can the affiliates do? So one, we're going to put in the chat the link to the Black Resiliency Network, join the Black Resiliency Network. And so Zaina, just so you know, as part of, I'm just going to answer this real quick before we move on. As part of the work that we're doing for the Health Equity Strategic Plan, we actually have health equity implementation and learning community on environmental justice, which includes disaster preparedness, that is working on this. So I would say hold tight. We're actually going to put something out sometime early next year that is going to give a lot of these resources and some plans for affiliates to think about. But for now, as Dr. Martin, Mississippi Urban League really is one of the ones that is leading on this effort. So I just wanted to say that. So Zaina had a couple of questions in the chat. So Marcus and Brandi, resiliency. You know, we also have to think about climate change and what's happening in our communities, where our communities are having to think about things that they didn't previously because of the change and what's happening in climate change, no matter who wants to deny it. There are changes happening to our climates that are impacting our abilities to recover faster from disasters, but also making disasters that don't normally occur in communities happen. So how do we think about resiliency along this whole climate change and climate resiliency kind of continuum?
I can kick us off with this question. So before we talk about disasters, and I want to be clear that when we're talking about disasters, we're talking about the types of situations that overwhelm our capacity to deal with it ourselves. So it requires additional resources beyond what we already have. So with that as context, this exceeding of our capacity to leverage our own resources to deal with the situation. Climate change is worsening the traditional ways that we think about disasters in terms of natural disasters, man-made disasters, but it's also worsening the I'll just say not agreed upon disaster of racism, right? So for every disaster that impacts communities of color, particularly Black communities and Indigenous communities, and or Native American communities and Latinx communities, we know that racism is the foundational or fundamental ongoing disaster that communities are dealing with that is overwhelming their existing resources to navigate. And then you have something, a traditional disaster that happens that creates a disaster within a disaster. And then you have climate change worsening both. You have climate change worsening the ways that communities are experiencing disasters, particularly poor and working class communities of color. And then you also have climate change impacting the way that racism or environmental justice or climate justice issues, so the way that we're disproportionately bearing the burden of climate impacts separate from traditional disasters.
I also think when we talk about climate change, we are dealing with a compound crisis of climate change. So there's so many things happening at the same time, which I think Dr. Martin spoke to, but we're also dealing with the fact that what we have done for the last 100 years around disasters is no longer working. So not only is FEMA changing and emergency management is changing, and we see some of the challenges going on between federal, state, and local communications around emergencies, but we're also seeing the challenges of the homes that we're building back in these communities. Are we building them back in a way that will ensure that they are not susceptible to the same disasters that we're trying to save them from? So one of the things that I saw in the Los Angeles wildfires that I had never heard before was that there are sprinkler systems now for your roof to keep your home from catching fire. Well, that's not something that we talk about often in our communities, that you could, outfit your roof with some type of a sprinkler system that could keep your home safe from a wildfire. I also have seen recently that there are people who are creating homes out of concrete and they're like building it with a 3D printer. And in some of these flood prone areas, why are we continuing to build with wood? And, why are we thinking that the ways that we've done this forever and ever and ever are the ways that we need to continue to do it, especially for our communities and for communities that find it challenging to rebuild? One of the conversations that I used to have with people when I was at FEMA was, you have to start thinking about these disasters from the standpoint of your ability to be able to manage them on your own. And that is so much more relevant today than it was when I was originally having those conversations. So financially, is your insurance enough to be able to allow you to go back into the home that you were in before? Are you living in an area where you can afford to rebuild if you need to rebuild, or where you can afford to even have the insurance that is required to be able to get some of your things back? Because as we all know, FEMA is not in its current structure able to provide that, even with the volatility that's happening right now. And so, as urban leaguers and as community leaders, and even with the Disaster Resilience Network, we've got to think outside the box about what are the ways that we can protect our communities. Where do we want to situate our communities? And how can we prepare them in advance for something that could happen? And then once something does happen, if we're really going to be resilient and prepared for climate change, how are we rebuilding in ways that can ensure that our communities are safe?
The only thing that I will add is to the conversation about what resiliency is, and I think not just what affiliates, but what the royal we can do about it or should keep in mind. I think one of the opportunities that the Urban League specifically has is doing something that it's done since its inception, which is mobilizing and getting and mobilizing right people with different experiences to help frame and address problems. And a very specific way, Randy alluded to this, that I think that the Urban League and the Urban League affiliates can really drive some conversations that honestly or might sound out of your skill set or out of depth based on what you're focused on, is the conversation of insurance. And what's true is, as we've seen more communities impacted by various forms of natural hazards, unfortunately, we have also seen some complications with people being able to either access insurance or being able to absorb and withstand the constant clip of disasters. And it's resulted in some policies, some insurance policies that are not favorable to folks that might be focused on helping people with housing. Or like, right, you hear some of the stories where you have some insurance industries pulling out of places and spaces, not because they're bad people, but because the business says it's not an insurable risk. And so my advice would be, regardless of where your affiliate is on the conversation of resiliency, of disasters, when we think about the concept of resilience, I think some of it is my recommendation, and I tell this to our local United Ways: start with the thing that you do best first, and then build out your path to resiliency from there. We know, right, the National Urban League has its foundational goals of health, quality of life, housing and community development, jobs, entrepreneurship, business development. All of those are aspects of what we think about with resilience. And the good news is the Urban League has a lot of partners in each one of those spaces and places that I think are equally grappling with this. And so I think it would be, and it's something that I know I've tried to be mindful of in our organization. I think the scope and scale of the problems that are in front of us are gonna require, I think, listening a bit differently from different perspectives. And I'm not talking about along ideological lines. Like, I'm on my own learning journey from people in the insurance industry about what it is they are thinking about and how they are talking about addressing some of these needs, because they still want to be in the insurance business. And I pick on insurance specifically because I know many affiliates either have a relationship with an insurance company, either on their board or in some other form or fashion, or you're probably going to have some members that are looking to use insurance as a pathway to economic mobility. And so that's a place and space where I think you can open up some unique opportunities to help frame discussions that are really in the sweet spot for your urban league, but then also allows some additional advanced conversation of, ways that we can think about and frame resilience. Same can be said for education in other areas, and including the preservation and expansion of small businesses post disasters. Unfortunately, one of the other harsh truths about just where we are as a country and where we are with our risk to natural hazards is small businesses are going to be the organizations disproportionately impacted by either closures or never having the opportunity to reopen in the first place. And so I know that there's a big area of focus for many affiliates, is that small business ecosystem, which of course is the driver of economic strength in many communities across the country. And that may be another space and place where you'll find a lot of allies that want to ensure that they can at least address some of the economic narratives that follow the resilience conversation.
And I'll just add very quickly that to reinforce the insurance conversation in this as organizations, but also in terms of communities. For folks where there is an opportunity, where folks do have access to insurance, which I know, to Marcus's point, they've been pulling out in different areas. But for folks who do have access to insurance, to make sure that we're encouraging residents in the communities to take a look at their insurance, to see what is the value of their insurance in terms of what it will cover to rebuild versus what it actually costs to rebuild, and see if there's any changes to the policy that need to be made. So every so often you can update your insurance policy, and that also that renters have insurance as well, wherever possible. It's usually pretty affordable, in any ways that we can support folks, and having renters insurance is really helpful, even if they live in a family owned property, because if there is home insurance, they will not be, their property will not be covered in the insurance policy. And then the last piece I wanted to mention is just around resilience in and of itself, that when we're thinking about resilience, building on what has been set up to this point, that we're thinking about what are the ways that we can facilitate excellence in how we prepare, how we respond, how we recover in terms of disasters, but also what's special about resilience, because it's not just disaster management, it's and how do we make sure that and at every point that we're integrating the day-to-day realities of communities into the process. What are the ways that we're able to support the health, wealth, and preservation of our history and culture before, during, and after disasters? So making sure that we're connecting those dots. So the work that the National Urban League does and that's happening at the different affiliates is directly connected to our ability to build a stronger foundation for resilience in our communities.
I love that, Dr. Martin. I think what you get me to is when we're talking about building resilience is thinking through, we've all alluded to or talked to about what's happening at the federal level that may not make it easy for people to get the aid they need. What are the kind of changes, policy advocacy? Because a lot of things that we do, particularly at the local level, is advocate for change, whether it's, regulations, whether it's legislation, whether it's, programmatic changes at your local and state government. What are the policy changes that we need or are we seeing need to happen to support communities in this time, particularly as we're seeing some, pulling back from FEMA on some of these issues and on some of these recovery efforts? Can we talk about what people need to be kind of pushing there? Marcus said, get with your mayor, or Brandi said, don't go with your mayor, just not don't with your mayor, but not only the elected, but also the people who are running, your emergency management. What is it that we need to be advocating for?
I mean, I think the first thing that is critical is insurance. And I think we've alluded to it a few times, but most of the people that we encounter when a disaster happens, we have a conversation and we say, okay, we need you to register or apply with your insurance first before you register with FEMA, so that we can see what your insurance is going to provide you. And people don't know where their insurance documentation is. They don't know what's covered. They don't know how that's going to impact them. They think that they can't be insured because they're renters, to some of the points that have been made earlier. And so, um, until we have a fulsome conversation about the challenges with insurance in this country and the fact that it's sometimes not even possible to purchase it, I think we're going to continue to have this tug with emergency management and with resources like FEMA, where we have to see that your insurance has provided you assistance before we're able to pay you. And even beyond that, when we talk about FEMA or emergency management dollars, whether it's from the state level or the federal level, it's not going to be enough to help us through this climate change issue. I mean, let's just have a real conversation about dollars and cents and what's available. And so we've got to come up with a different way of addressing these disasters. And while insurance is currently broken, like, we can advocate for that and we can advocate for change around that. But what are the specific things that people in your community need to be able to be okay without federal dollars, without state dollars, without insurance support. Those are the policies and the conversations that I would want to have with elected leaders. And, you know, I'm the communicator of the bunch. I think there's lots of information out there, but I don't think it's communicated well. And it's definitely not communicated well prior to the event happening. We talk about it once the event has happened, when people are dealing with their own trauma from the fact that something that terrible has happened to them. And so, from a communications perspective, I think the Urban League is uniquely positioned to help local governments to come up with the kinds of messages, the kinds of trusted messengers to get messages out to people so that they can be prepared for what's going to happen as a result of disaster.
No,
No,
for sure.
thank you. Oh, go ahead, Marcus.
No, I
Perfect.
was going to say, I appreciate your question, Dr. Isaac, and to Brandy's point, I'll say that there is, to your point about like policy, I think that for a lot of reasons, folks have felt on the defensive, and the season that we're in actually provides some healthy opportunities to go on offense in terms of advocacy. And I want to come back to something that Dr. Martin specifically spoke about. The truth about emergency management, disaster response, recovery, everything technically is planned for ahead of time. It should be. And so, an area for advocacy in a direct way is looking at communities' efforts to do pre-disaster recovery planning and getting a sense of how they are already deciding what decisions they're going to make or what kind of information and data is going to guide their decisions. Unfortunately, Dr. Martin, Brandy, and I have been in many conversations with mayors of upset communities, with community members. We typically in our prior life, well, in Brandi and I's prior life, we're trying to coach people in the midst of a disaster. And we would always have someone from a community-based organization come in and pound the table and demand a bunch of things that honestly were already decided because they weren't involved in asking the right questions around how that particular jurisdiction has already planned for recovery. They know who will be at the table. They have had different conversations that are related to, and we're talking about at the county level now, you have the county planning agency, you have the economic development agency, you have the housing agency. And what's also true is we know that, right, they don't always have it figured it out up front. And so I think a place where you should be proactive and really leaning in on, and I'll say increasingly, this is something that is true for a lot of the emergency management community, especially at the state and local level, is there's going to be even more of an emphasis and a requirement to really have policies, processes, and at some point laws in place to address pre-disaster recovery planning and how disaster recovery is going to be managed at the local and state level. So that's a place where you can and should be playing offense in a considerable way as a constructive partner now, and then when you need to be an accountable partner later.
I love that. Thank you, Marcus. I love that, like an action step. Basically, we need to get on those committees or at least be in contact with them, even if we're not sitting at the table, even though we should sit at the table, but know who's sitting at the table so that we can provide them the information about our communities that are going to be helpful. Brandi, I want to go back to this communication aspect. It was going to be my last question, but I want to ask you now because you came to it. If there's one thing as urban leagues that we should be communicating, or just people in general to communities, because we know, I think Marcus just said it, it always trickles down to the community too late, last minute, when we're already in the emergency or disaster. What should we be communicating to our communities now? What should we be telling them before the hurricane hits, before the building falls down, before the earthquake, before the water crisis, before the fire? What should they know now?
So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I will give you some specific points, but I've also been putting my thoughts to paper so that I can share with you all some guidance to be able to share with communities, because I think it's really essential. But prior to a disaster happening, you have to have a plan. Most of our disasters that take people out of here are no notice disasters. And when something happens that you have not planned for, you have to either already have a go bag, already have a plan in place, already know where you're going to go, what you're going to do. And unfortunately, sometimes we don't have that. And so having a plan is critical. The second is really having a plan around what's going to happen with your home. Like, is insurance going to be enough? If insurance isn't enough, is savings going to be enough? Where could you potentially live if something were to happen? How would you continue to get to work if something would happen? Would you be able to continue to work at that job? And these kinds of conversations, unfortunately, aren't always a part of a document that I could send you that FEMA would have or your emergency manager would have. They're conversations that you have to have across your family about what is it that we're going to do if something were to happen to us. Because what I'm seeing now in this landscape of the LA wildfires and other disasters that have really ravaged individuals is just people who have now got earned knowledge, like bought sense from the fact that a disaster happened to them. And they're putting things into TikTok videos or online notes or what have you about what they think that people should do ahead of a disaster. But those things haven't all been pulled together so that people can actually see, okay, if a wildfire could potentially happen to me, these are the exact steps that I should take. And unfortunately, it is different depending on where you live. It's different depending on how much insurance you have. It's different depending on the type of disaster. And so all of those resources are out there, but being able to pull it all together, I think is the biggest challenge. And so I have a document, and I will definitely be sharing that, Lydia, with you so that you can share it with other urban leaguers. I know we did a session earlier this year with Nicole and FEMA, really helping you to think through what happens before, during, and after disasters as affiliates. Community organizations, I think, would benefit from that. I'm sure that Dr. Martin continues to do that kind of work just to help people to understand what they should do prior to a disaster. But it's nuanced and it's multi-layered. And so the communication that's required is critical in the moment. Like, what do you tell people when they know that there are Santa Ana winds in their area and there's a potential for a wildfire? What do you tell people so that they can specifically take action with these horrific floods that happened in Texas recently? And those messages are there, but you've got to have like folks in place or have those messages already queued up to be able to share them with your community. And so my goal as a communicator is to make that more accessible to people. But having a plan for what you're going to do prior to a disaster, and then having a plan for your life if something were to upend it, I think are the main things that I would encourage you all to be able to share with your communities.
So I took something from that, and I'm gonna get to you in a minute, Dr. DeMartin. So the first thing I took actually from that, which we will add to our kit, is we should know what possibly can impact our communities, right? Where, like, because, what impacts Detroit is different from what impacts LA, what impacts Florida, what impacts Texas, what impacts Boston. And so having our urban leagues understand, here are the things, because we can't, man-made disasters, we can't, besides the one that's going to happen, climate change, we can't predict, but we can somewhat, we know the possibility of the natural disasters that could possibly happen, even though even some of those are shifting and changing in ways. And so I think, to me, one of the things I heard is knowing that, right? Because then that determines, as Brandi just said, what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, and what is possible. And so that's half the battle. Dr. Martin, you were going to say something.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Isaac. Appreciate you. And thank you, Brandi, for that amazing framing. And I think to build on this idea of what it means to share information with communities, what it means to prepare, what it means to facilitate resilience, want to go back to the idea of planning, right? When we're talking about planning, particularly for Urban League affiliates, understanding the communications aspect internally. So the community is going to depend on many of you or all of you for information and guidance and direction in response and in recovery. And so the more informed that you are about the disasters that could impact you, as was mentioned before, but also what um, are the plans that the local jurisdiction has, to Marcus's point earlier, but also where are the gaps? Because oftentimes, emergency managers, and I used to be in that world at the local and county and state level. I don't have a better way to say this, so my apologies, but can be very arrogant, and you can't take it personally. They think they know everything. They think they're covered. And so, from an advocacy and a collective organizing perspective, you are going to have to do your homework, as you would for anything that you're advocating or organizing around. Make sure that you understand what the best practices are, and there are some very basic guidance documents around that. I know Marcus and Brandi have been a part of helping to develop at the FEMA level, but making sure that our communities get what they deserve and what they've earned in terms of response and recovery. And that means that in the plans, there's certain things that should be in there. How are they talking about where resources are going to go? Who are the partners that are going to receive those resources? What have they talked about as it relates to recovery? There's a lot of jurisdictions that don't have recovery plans written down. So you may be, just by virtue of having the conversation, catalyzing certain types of conversations and progress towards having some more clarity on some of these issues when it comes to recovery. Because a lot of times it is a messy process that gets put off on the community and on community-based organizations to figure out, with limited local government participation. They kind of hand it off to you and say, recover. And, we'll be in the background, doing whatever they're going to be doing. But ultimately, it's going to land on the communities to play a leadership role. And if we are not prepared to play that leadership role, someone else will come into our community and do it for us. And we don't want that, because that is how we continue to perpetuate the further compounding of a disaster with post-disaster inequities in resources and recovery. So Urban League affiliates have an incredibly powerful role that can be played in the disaster recovery and ultimately resilient space. And then the last thing I just wanted to share was, as we're talking about plans and communication, and the fact that each affiliate needs to have their own continuity plan in terms of how are you going to continue to operate when something impacts your organization, to also think about how you're going to organize with local community organizations, as Marcus mentioned earlier, and what does it mean with the relationship with the local government? How are you going to get the necessary supplies and equipment and resources you need to support your organization post-disaster, as well as helping to facilitate that for communities? How are we going to get the training that we need? And these are all things that we can ask local and state emergency management folks, and depending on where you are, county emergency management folks, to make sure that we have our own plans in each of these pieces, but that also we're a part of the money that's being spent on training and education around emergency management plans and implementation that are happening, as well as the exercises that they do after, before a disaster happens. We, in a lot of communities, a lot of local level government, they're doing these exercises to practice how they would respond in different disasters. So we need to be doing those in our communities and in our organizations, but we also need to be a part of whatever the jurisdictions are doing, because that is how they play in practice, and therefore that is how they are going to perform when disasters happen in the community.
Thank you for that. I think that's really important about practice, right? The way you kind of exercise a muscle to do something is by practicing. And so if you're not part of these exercises that are practicing, where do you go? I remember when I lived in Baltimore, there was these signs and that was evacuation signs. And I was like, I don't know what this means. You know what I mean? I just used to see them. I'm like, well, I guess if I'm evacuate, I'm going to go that way. But nobody ever really told us. I was new to the city. I never heard anybody talking about what would we do, like if we had to, because we were by the water, actually evacuate. I was like, I guess I'll follow the signs. They had the signs, which I think was great, but nobody ever told us how to use the sign. What does that mean? What happens when the signs end? Because eventually the signs end. So then where do I go, right? So I think it's important about this idea of practicing, letting people know what are the routes, how do you get out so you're not in gridlock if you're trying to evacuate. And I mean, there's always going to be some gridlock, but ways to think about that. So I think that's a really point. There is a good question in the chat that I think goes back to something we all were talking about on. And I think particularly, Brandi, you were talking about being prepared and knowing what is in like plans and what's in your assurance. And Dr. Espy, who is of course with the Mississippi Urban League, who has been doing a lot of work on this, has really been thinking about this issue of heirs, right? There's a lot of people, particularly in our community, it's Big Mama's house. Big Mama gave it to me, but nobody has any paperwork, right? And so if you don't have any paperwork for that second uncle's house or your grandmother's house or your parents' house, so not you don't have a paperwork for the deed. You may not be on the insurance, but you're the one living in the house because either Big Mama has passed or is somewhere else. How do we talk about this concept, or what do we think about this concept of heirs heirs property? And so I just want to talk a little bit about that, and then there's another question in the chat.
So one of the things that FEMA has done extremely well recently is to make it easier for people who are in that predicament, who have family homes that have not been passed down through the courts, but have been passed down through their family, to be able to receive assistance. And so I'm going to place a resource in the chat that explains a little bit more on how people can receive assistance based off of airship. I also have a document that I created that I will share from the Los Angeles wildfires, just to give you a sense. We did a webinar called Ask FEMA, which I think is a good template that maybe Urban League affiliates could use, just to explain to people, this is what FEMA can provide. This is what it looks like. These are all of the ways that you can access it. These are the appeal forms. These are considerations to take into account. And you can, dissect that document however you choose to be able to pull out the information that's most important for your community. But explaining to people, especially about airship and other rules that FEMA utilizes, that people can have access to, is extremely important. I will give you an example. I used to go to community meetings a lot from the wildfires, and trust is extremely important. So people would trust me to explain things to them that maybe they would not trust another one of my counterparts from FEMA to explain things. And so being a part of the Urban League, being a trusted voice in the community, bringing this information, I think is going to be extremely important. And two, there are so many details to government programs. I don't care what program it is that need to be explained, that level of trust goes a long way to help people to better understand the specifics about what they can do, what statements they can include in their appeal letters so that they can get access to assistance, whether it's for airship, for someone who's passed away, for a lot of different things that people don't necessarily know that they have access to through FEMA. So I'll put both of those links in the chat, and hopefully that can help. But FEMA has gone a long way towards people being able to get assistance for homes that have been bequeathed to them verbally and not through the court.
So I'm not 100% sure what this question is trying to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And the question is around, is there a step-by-step guide on planning around ICE detainment of family members? And I'm assuming during a disaster is what the person is asking. If not, maybe they can try to clarify. So,
So let me just touch on that really quickly. Los Angeles has done a lot of great work around this. And so let me see if I can find something that I can share that gives you some information on that planning effort. Because it may be different in different communities, but I know LA has done a lot of work on it. Please know that some of the protections that have been in place for individuals um, who are applying for assistance through the federal government, who are showing up to federal locations like shelters and things like that, are no longer in place. And so being careful is extremely important, but there are some specific guidelines that people have put together um, that hopefully can happen during these times, can help you during these times in order to protect your communities. But I want to make sure that you guys are aware of some of the changes that have happened within the federal government that could make people more susceptible to being picked up.
So, and the person clarified a little bit. I don't think there is a planning guide, a step-by-step planning guide to dealing with ICE detainment right now. I think we're all kind of working as we go along because this is all very new because there used to be protections that are no longer there. So I think it's a work in progress to the attendee who's asking the questions about that. So I just want to say that. I don't think there is one. So we only have 3 minutes left, and I want to definitely be cognizant of everybody's time. So even though I already asked the question, I'm still gonna ask Brandi to answer it again. You don't have to answer it first. If there's one thing that we could leave this um, webinar with for not only Urban League affiliates, but also the community members, because this will be on YouTube where lots of people can see it. What is the one kind of resource and or tip that you'd like to leave Urban League affiliates and community members with about anything around disaster preparedness and emergency preparedness that they can take with them after they leave this webinar? And I'm going to start with Dr. Martin.
I knew you were going to do that, Dr. Isaac. So one thing I want to just name is that Next Leadership Development has a summer program where young people ages 14 to 24 as team leaders and team members learn about emergency management, disaster preparedness, climate change, racial justice. And they are actually watching this a webinar in the other side of the office in our training room. And so I just want to acknowledge them and let them know how much we appreciate them, how wonderful they've been doing this summer, and to continue on the theme of gratitude and action. I just also want to say thank you to you, Dr. Isaac, for facilitating this and hosting us. And given the time limit, one of the things that I will explicitly name is that faith without works is dead. And so we need to be prayerful, we need to be hopeful, but we also need to take intentional action to learn how things are supposed to go so that our communities are not left with practices that are not the best practices post-disaster. And that we're also continuing to organize within our communities and make sure that we're building partnerships with folks who can collectively work together on these issues. And then finally, to do what we can with what we have. There's a lot that we talked about today. It can feel overwhelming. Start with where you are. Marcus Coleman mentioned this earlier. Build on what you currently are doing and continue to grow and learn and evolve. But we need people in communities. We need folks like the Urban League, as well as the other grassroots community-based organizations to be able to have better information around disasters, as well as kind of these structures that get set up post-disaster so that we can play leadership roles and not just be at a table, but that we have our own tables that we're playing leadership roles and bringing people to as well.
Brandi, one thing.
One thing for communications. Okay. You are the trust holders. Like in disasters, your voice carries so much further than any press release I could send or any information that we can share. And so trust in these times is extremely important in communicating culturally relevant, locally driven, equity centered information. And the Urban League is in the center of that. So continue to lead with trust, so that communities know what to do.
Last word to Marcus.
Sure. Recognizing that the primary audience is Urban League affiliates and there may be other community-based organizations, my one thing would actually to have a board level conversation about what your organization's role is going to be when disaster strikes. I think often to the point that was made earlier, this is a full-time job. To be clear, like government agencies are underfunded to do this work, and we're laying out a lot of tips. But I think the one thing that would be helpful for every urban league to do, every affiliate, is having that board level conversation to get some parameters up front before disaster strikes on where that urban league is going to play its position during disaster recovery. Because as some of you all know, if you have not had that board level conversation, you run into a lot of governance issues very quickly, especially when you start having conversations about taking resources or building out resources that may be different than what your board had decided on prior for the year. And so I know that it's kind of antithetical to what we've been talking about because it's been all out there, but I'd say that board level conversation is going to be the most critical action you can take, I'd say between now and the end of this year, about just how you were going to show up and how you're going to be structured and what decisions you may want to raise. Especially if you were trying to educate the board, because I'm sure that many of your Urban League affiliates, it may be a board education opportunity to talk about the fact that the work is coming. And so I think having that conversation is going to be critically important.
Well, thank you all so much. We so appreciate your time. We know you all are busy and there's lots going on, but I think this was a really rich, important conversation to us to have. I would say to Marcus's point, show your board this webinar. That will be helpful in helping you go along the way. But I think it's important for us to take action to be part of it, be part of the recovery and the resiliency, the pre-disaster preparedness, the planning. I saw in the question and answer, a lot of people talk about checklist and planning. And the one thing I heard throughout this whole thing is that we have to plan. We can't wait for the disaster to happen. We have to be thinking about it beforehand. So practice, plan, and prepare. I would say that I'm trying to look for 3 Ps: practice, plan, prepare. So thank you all so much. Thank you all so much to our panelists. We are a little over time. We're 3 minutes, but just know that this will be posted on our YouTube page in a few weeks. And we just want to thank everybody so much. Have a great day. Enjoy your summer. Thank you all so much. We are internally grateful. Bye, everybody.